All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, fellow Arctic ambassadors, to invite myself and my fellow colleagues here to speak on behalf of tourism in the Arctic. Tourism can sometimes be sort of like the black sheep of the forum sometimes. We are involved with just about every stakeholder in the Arctic, but sometimes we can be thought of as a double-edged sword. Of course, we bring economy, not just by buying souvenirs, but also by looking at fees paid for landing fees and permits, for piloting fees, bunkering, chartering flights, and of course, on most of our ships, what we hope to use local produce, whether it be meat or fish, buying locally as much as possible. Of course, there is the flip side and possible negative issues that could happen, perhaps overuse of landing sites or, heaven forbid, marine pollution. But we gather here to talk about the positive future of the Arctic and how we can strategically move forward in a changing Arctic. There is no doubt that the world is changing drastically as the climate changes the world, and nowhere is this felt as strongly as it is in the extreme regions, the north and southern poles. But it's not confined to just the polar systems. As we know, what happens in the Arctic doesn't necessarily stay in the Arctic, and it moves to all facets of business, of economy. If you take a look at this slide, which shows the ship activity between 2008 and 2012 in the Arctic, you will see that between 2008 and 2012, the number of ships in the Arctic regions doubled. There's a very similar projection for the 2016 figures on this as well. And much of this is mainly due to increased supply needs, of course, as we heard yesterday of Inuit villages where the ice is retreating. They need to bring in more supplies because their hunting grounds are no longer where they used to be. But also, let's face it, for ships transiting the world, it's a lot easier to perhaps go through the Northwest or even the Northeast Passage, depending on your draft, rather than heading all the way down to the Panama Canal. However, if you take a look, cruise ships were actually a very small portion of this growth. And tourism has been in the Arctic since 1850 and has actually grown comparatively in size very little. There are, of course, exceptions. The Crystal Serenity, which we'll be visiting this summer and planning to move from Seward through the Northwest Passage to New York. Quite surprising, a ship of this size, and no doubt a concern, not only from perhaps a hamlet look by the number of people who might be coming ashore, but simply also for perhaps search and rescue practicalities as well, should something go wrong. But for the most part, when I'm speaking of tourism in the Arctic, I'm not speaking of ships like the Crystal Serenity. Rather, I'm speaking of expedition ships, like the one that I work on, which is the National Geographic Explorer. And these are ships which we pride ourselves on well-managed and educated guests, which we feel really leads to sustainable tourism. And then there's that word again, education. We've been hearing words as education, and I'm sure we'll continue to hear it throughout these sessions, and others like strategy, research, development, collaboration, and communication. These are all key for the long-term strategic plan for the Arctic, not only for tourism, but how we can collaborate with all the stakeholders that are in this room, for legislation, business, and conservation. There's, of course, as far as tourism goes, I could go off on many, many different tangents, but I'm going to focus on education. The vast majority of the guests who travel to the Arctic are ones that want to experience the Arctic in a different way. They want to be immersed in the environment and the cultures that are found in the Arctic. They're people who will tell their friends that I'm going to Greenland for my vacation, and their friends will first, of course, give them this sideways glance, a little bit confused, but then say, wow, that's awesome, and perhaps also inspire them to continue and visit Greenland or Nunavut or Iceland. As operators, it's our job to do this responsibly and with an eye for setting the bar of well-managed tourism that has only a minor or a transitory impact in a positive way in the Arctic. Back again to collaboration and communication with legislative bodies, creating guidelines for sustainability, working with governments. We are the ones with our feet on the ground and the ones who are constantly seeing the changes that happen in the Arctic and in the Antarctic for that matter. And we want to be able to continue to see and show our guests this while still giving them that wow factor while they're here. Most of our trips involve education and actually move around that subject. As it's been said, education is empowerment, and that's for all parties involved. It's in part why we come to forums like this, so that we can at least talk between ourselves as stakeholders and learn the issues we face. Some of us may have never actually been to the Arctic, other than your hometowns or other than sitting in a legislative office. But if we can get across to each other exactly what makes it so special and why we're all gathered here, that's a big part of being here. And education spreads to all parts of our tourism operations. Education's for our staff so that they understand the environment in which they're leading the guests, creating a real understanding of the issues that are in the Arctic, whether it be climate change, whether it be the Inuit culture. So we can also work with other companies. We all are in it together so that we can communicate best practices between the companies. I know I work with Jørn at Hurtigruten. We work both in the Arctic and in the Antarctic together. And in amongst the ships and when we're out in the field, it's very much a transparent and a team working environment. Expedition leaders communicating amongst each other about sites, about incidents. So it gives us a greater sense of transparency. And of course, our biggest education goal is to our guests. Whether it be face down in the tundra or following year-round projects we support before or after the voyage, like Meet the North, where we have National Geographic photographers and correspondents moving through the Arctic. They've just spent actually a month and a half in Pond Inlet and documenting life in the Arctic and the Arctic peoples. And of course, learning about the strong history that the Arctic has, not just for the first Thule, but also the history of Viking exploration or the current science that is happening in the Arctic. All this knowledge creates ambassadors. All of us in this room, we are already ambassadors. It's a reason why we are here. But we cannot push for legislation and conservation alone. We need our body backed by voices from the public. We need the visitors of the Arctic to go home and talk to their friends, tell them why Iceland, Greenland, Nunavut, Quebec, so many places in the Arctic are so special and why we need to inspire them to educate themselves about the current and future struggles of the Arctic. I'm always inspired, and my hope for the future is rejuvenated at forums such as these, where members from diverse backgrounds and business, government, education, and cultures come together with a common goal: the preservation and growth of the Arctic for years to come, but done in a responsible and thoughtful way. But I have to remind myself that it doesn't happen with a snap of the finger, and I know many of us would like that to happen, for it to suddenly be where we are, where we'd like to be, 20 years from now already. But we must be patient, we must work together, we must collaborate, we must communicate, and look towards the greater long-term goal. As long as we work together, the future is stronger, and a well-managed Arctic is ours. Thank you.